Thank you very much, Antonio. And thank you for inviting us. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I should add a slight addition to what Antonio just said. I'm a former professor. I'm Professor Emeritus at this point, having just retired, but still very active. And very grateful to be here, especially and not only because it's an opportunity to engage in ideas and to talk and to discuss what is relevant to you, but also because it's summer here. And it's a chance to get away from the cold and the dark and so on. Okay. I was unsure about how to pitch this talk. In other words, I wasn't sure at what level. So some of it may seem very basic to some of you, or maybe not. If it's too confusing or if I'm going too fast, please stop me. If you have a question, please stop me. Say, what are you trying to do here? What are you saying? Or what does this mean? Please feel free, okay? I don't have it's okay. Yeah. So this is basically an outline. I want to do a very quick and dirty history of the notion of epistemology, what it means to know. And then I want to move into various questions around the sociology of knowledge. And we'll try to break it down into a number of basic concepts and then talk about what is basically the problem of epistemic injustice. That's okay. And I'll try to do all that in 45 minutes without speaking too fast. Is that okay? Everybody's with me? Okay. Antonia, can you? So here's a simple question, and if you've ever taken a philosophy course, you know this problem. Why are we not brains in a vat, or are we brains in a vat? We're really just brains in a vat, and someone's feeding us information, and what we're experiencing isn't real at all, but somebody is sitting at a computer terminal and feeding us this information. Really, the world as we understand it is an artifact of the information that's being fed to us in a brain, as a brain in a vat. This seems silly at first, but of course in philosophy, this kind of question then leads you to a whole range of other problems. It's not that we seriously consider ourselves brains in vats, but it opens up the problems of how do we know, what do we know, what is it possible to know, how certain are we of knowledge, and so on. And so this modern version of this question is really an extension of a very old problem, if we can. And we can go back to Plato, for example, in the Republic, who talks about the situation in the cave where only the philosopher truly understands, so there's at least one person in this room who truly understands reality, but the rest of us are like prisoners sitting chained to a wall in the cave. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. Chained to a wall in the cave, and we see shadows projected on the wall in front of us that are coming from behind, where someone is showing us particular images, but we're not seeing the world as is. And here's a question of skepticism that is being used to tell a story about the way things really are. So for Plato, of course, the world of forms, the true world, the world that we want to understand as, he wants his audience to understand as the true world, is available only after we free ourselves from the illusion of the cave. And the metaphor of the cave, there was a nice illustration of that in Wikipedia, if you want to go ahead. There you see the manipulation of images and the release from the cave to understand the world as it is. So here we have a very old problem, namely Plato uses skepticism as a way of convincing us, trying to convince us that there's a true world of forms. Okay. And of course, there's an updated version of that in Descartes, who questions his, in his meditations, uses his method to doubt everything. And he said, what if there is some demon that essentially keeps me from knowing the world as it is, but is in fact feeding me some kind of false version of the world? Descartes, who was appropriately educated in a Jesuit college, so you should feel some connection with Descartes here, comes to this problem by saying, again, using skepticism as a form of getting to where he sees the truth lies. Namely, we can doubt everything except at that point where we doubt our own thought, and then we come to the cogito, I think, therefore I am. And for Descartes, that was an important move, because he was, among other things, not only trying to argue against his what was strictly Catholic education, but also Renaissance skepticism. Okay, so this issue of doubt, the capacity to doubt what we know, has a very long pedigree. If we go ahead. And it carries on into the English or the analytic tradition. And most famously, of course, we see that in Locke and Hume. Locke begins this process by dividing essentially the degrees of knowledge into intuitive, demonstrative, and sensitive. Intuitive knowledge is simply what we know, and demonstrative knowledge is that which can be proved. So an isosceles triangle is equal in area when two isosceles triangles are drawn between parallel lines, for example. That's demonstrative knowledge. But then there's sensitive knowledge, which is what most of our knowledge consists of. And it has a certain probability. It is that which apprehends primary qualities, which we can know with a degree of certainty, size, shape, matter, motion. But then there are secondary qualities, which are products of the act of perception. And Locke is very clear that we're not certain about secondary qualities. In other words, secondary qualities do not come to us with the degree of certainty that primary qualities come to us with. So here we see a break then already with, in the English tradition of philosophy, a small wedge into our conception of knowing with certainty. And then David Hume, perhaps he spent too much time in the cold north of Scotland, he comes to an even more radical position. Humean skepticism comes out of this particular argument that our understanding is based on impressions and ideas are the persistence of prior impressions. So we have impressions, and some of those hang around and become ideas. And the impressions themselves are based on sensation and reflection. But sensations are of an unknown cause. In other words, we do not know where our sensations come from. They simply are there. And this is Humean skepticism, of course, the point at which Hume himself seems to say it doesn't matter. We don't need to know this because we cannot know it. And of course, it leads to a whole tradition of argumentation, particularly with Thomas Reid and the Scottish Common Sense School and so on. But what we have then is a long tradition of skepticism about our capacity to know. Okay? All right. So what I want to do is bring this into the modern era and see what this means, at least for our understanding of knowledge, but then also for our understanding of how two very traditional streams of argument about knowledge come together in the notion of epistemic injustice. So let's follow out the philosophical stream. So one version of how to deal with skepticism comes to us through Hegel. And this is really a simplification, so you'll have to forgive me, but I've tried to make it as plain as I could. Skepticism for Hegel is a failure of the fit between an object as it exists in itself and an object as it exists for us. So there are things in the world that exist, and there's things in the world that that object exists for me in a certain way, okay? And that fit is not complete. The failure then of this form of consciousness leads to an attempt to try to understand the object as it exists through what is essentially a state of consciousness. In other words, epistemology here becomes a problem of consciousness. And it's one way to avoid the question of what is the final external distinction or criterion of knowledge, but rather the criterion of knowledge is now determined by consciousness. And this is Hegel's phenomenology. That's one route that epistemology will take. And then the second route is essentially the science route. Eventually, of course, this was the outcome of analytic philosophy in the 19th century, that is to resolve the problem of epistemology by turning it into a question of science, is most famously done here by Willard Quine, the American philosopher, who argues that since we cannot find a foundation or a first philosophy and secure knowledge on some external point of view, what we can do is say, well, we can turn it into a question of science. And how do we turn it into a question of science? We, instead of asking what's the relationship between our beliefs and the evidence in the world, we should ask how we go about moving from evidence to belief. So in a sense, it becomes a kind of psychological question. How is it that we come to believe things about the world that we take as given or we take as certain? That is, there's a scientific question here. We can resolve this scientific question. And by resolving the scientific question, we can come to some understanding of what knowledge is. And so this makes epistemology a psychological question, except we now have a different problem, namely, what justifies science? In other words, there's no obvious external way in which science is a guaranteed foundation for knowledge. Science is possibly the most powerful tool we have for creating new knowledge, but we do so on a kind of pragmatic front. That is, Quine doesn't solve the problem of skepticism. He simply moves it into scientific realm. That is, he gives it another frame without actually resolving the problem. And so the problem of skepticism is still a modern problem. The question of knowing hasn't been resolved in some once and for all way, at least not by philosophy, at least not in the analytic tradition of philosophy. But of course, philosophers aren't the only ones who have been talking about knowledge. There's a whole other tradition that I want to turn to now. So here's, let me finish off the question of science, because the question of science has been problematized in the last half century or so, beginning in the 1950s with Hansen and Kuhn in 1960. In other words, the philosophy and history of science have long ago abandoned the notion that science is some kind of Archimedean point that we can turn to resolve the question of knowledge. But I can say more about this, but if people are familiar with this, I'll move on. Okay? In the post-Marxist traditions, there is a long discussion about what it means to know. And that's, of course, because Marx raised the issue of the essentially class divisions among all forms of not just labor, but all forms of cultural products. And it was the post-Marxists who have taken this up. And what I've done is pulled a few post-Marxists out for illustration. Gramsci, in particular, in his prison notebooks, while he sat in a dark, cold Italian prison for 11 years before he died in prison, argued that cultural hegemony is one of the important features that prevents the working class from freeing itself, and cultural hegemony is carried out by the bourgeoisie, and the intellectuals are an important part of this. They have more than technical knowledge. They take part in particular struggles for hegemony. And what Gramsci argued for was that what we need is intellectuals who are organizers and persuaders, not just simple orators. So knowing for Gramsci is never just having access to the truth, which is a word that he never uses in his writing. In other words, knowledge itself is part of a political process. Okay? Then on the German side of the continent, Karl Mannheim is essentially viewed as the founder of the sociology of knowledge, and argues that knowledge is always a relation between beliefs and a concrete situation. In other words, knowledge never exists out here somewhere. Knowledge is always part of a relation between people who know and the situation in which they know. And this then becomes the sociology of knowledge. And so truth, therefore, doesn't belong to beliefs about a situation, but is in the situation itself. And he called this relationism, and became the beginning of what was then seen as sociology of knowledge. Okay? All right. The classic text of mid-20th century or mid to late 20th century sociology of knowledge is Berger and Luckman's Social Construction of Reality. And this will bring us closer to psychology. Berger and Luckman, two actually Austrians who fled Austria and ended up in the United States, although I think Berger retired back to Austria before he died. Anyway, Berger and Luckman wrote an influential book where they argued that sociology of knowledge isn't just about formal modes of knowledge, but what Berger and Luckman said we really should be interested in is everyday forms of knowledge, ordinary forms of knowledge, practical forms of knowledge. How do those practical forms of knowledge come into the existence? How do we know, how do we make relationships work? How do we know to make relationships work? How do we come to understand certain things about relationships? How do we understand our relationship to institutions? For example, how do we know to negotiate something like a university? That's a very complex set of procedures. It has gotten more complex, in my view, over the last several decades, but it's a form of everyday knowledge that has to be arrived at through some kind of social process. And that's what they're interested in. Everyday taken for granted reality comes to be constructed in some way. And that they introduce a number of terms like habitualization. In other words, we do certain things over and over and over again, and then that becomes a taken for granted reality. You go to the theater, you go to the grocery store, you go on vacation. These are things that we repeat endlessly in our lifetime, and so they become a kind of taken for granted reality. But again, within Berger and Luckman, there's a very clear understanding that there's no external criterion to which we can compare our everyday reality. There's no, as it were, formal way of testing our knowledge against some absolute truth. Okay? So that shook up, as it were, the sociology of knowledge in the 1960s and created a kind of a revolution in also psychology. We can go there. So in the 1980s, two versions of this enter psychology. One is by the Oxford philosopher of science or just Oxford philosopher, Ram Hare, who just passed away recently. And Hare began his career as a fairly standard philosopher of science, wrote an important book in philosophy of science, and then turned to psychology, and essentially spent the rest of his career as a kind of philosopher of psychology and social science. And he argues that taking up the notion of social constructionism, he says, well, the thing that Berger and Luckman were missing was the problem of language. So he argues that the fundamental human reality is a conversation. We're engaged in some kind of conversation, effectively without beginning or end, to which from time to time individuals make contributions. So in other words, as we are born, we are inserted into a conversation that goes on with or without us. Whether we like it or not, the conversation's ongoing. It's not a single conversation, it's obviously multiple. And at some point, we make contributions to this conversation. We challenge things, we agree with other things, we act in ways that changes the conversation. And all, argues Hare, all that is personal in our mental, emotional lives is individually appropriated from the conversation going on around us and can be transformed. In other words, we appropriate what it is that's going on in the conversation. We don't necessarily conform, we change things, we argue, and the conversation carries on. And the structure of thinking and feeling will reflect in various ways the form and content of the conversation. And so the main thesis, argues Hare in his 1984 book, the main thesis of this work is that mind is no sort of entity, but a system of beliefs structured by a cluster of grammatical models. So Hare works this out in a number of books, social being, physical being, personal being, three volumes sort of at the center of his career, and tries to argue that not only are we taking part in this conversation, but we are also bodies inside that conversation, and that our bodily being contributes to, in a number of complex ways, to the way in which we appropriate that conversation. All right. So now we have, as it were, a psychological version of social constructionism. Hare quite deliberately calls this social constructionism, as without appropriating the Berger and Luckman model, as a way of showing that we, as it were, make up the world, but we also appropriate from the world. That is, we're always doing both simultaneously. Okay? All right? Then the second version of social constructionism to emerge in psychology is Gergen's. I don't know how many people are familiar with Gergen. His is a radical relativist version of social constructionism, which essentially argues that there is no taken for granted world, and social constructionism is about the suspension of belief. But unfortunately for Gergen, there's no way to push that program forward. In other words, Gergen repeats this in multiple ways in many different forms over a period of about 30 years. Until recently, he came across the notion of relationism or relational being is what he calls it. And so through the notion of relationship, he's tried to, as it were, salvage this version of constructionism. That's a long story, and I can say more about that if you want. But I want to leave it for now. Okay. And I deliberately have left out an entire tradition here. There is a psychoanalytic tradition, which of course questions the notion of what it is we know and how we can know. But that tradition is long and complex, and I don't have time to even begin to talk about it here, assuming I'm familiar enough with all of the nuances of that to talk about it. But it is not only out of sociology of knowledge and that tradition, the neo-Marxist tradition, that we see 150, 200 years of questioning what it is to know, but we also come to it out of the psychoanalytic tradition, which says most of what we believe is irrational anyway, and we are driven by impulses that we're not aware of, or only vaguely aware of, until we begin to think through them as adults. Okay, so that's a whole other tradition of questioning the foundations of what we know and how we can know. Okay. And then something interesting happens. In the 1980s as well, or back in the 1980s, but we'll move forward very quickly now, feminists stand up and say, wait a minute, we've been doing this epistemology thing for a long time, but somehow it doesn't have anything to say about our lives or our experience. So this key notion that knowledge must address experience somewhere along the line is a new move, and it's a radical move. It says, why am I accepting questions of epistemology that in no way address my experience? And so we see, I've taken one particular quote from a recent historical evaluation of that moment. Epistemological questions concerning the status of knowledge, the forms that knowledge comes in, the justification of knowledge claims, and the goals of inquiry arise for feminists when they consider how the knowledge claims needed for feminism are generated, so how are knowledge claims generated, and what conditions, including social conditions, are required to develop feminist forms of knowledge and understanding. So feminists say, what do we need to know in order for us to develop feminism? They didn't say, what do we need to know? No, what do we need to know to develop feminism so that we can make sense of women's experience? So that was a radical shift here. And feminist epistemology didn't go away. In other words, if you look at the history of this particular movement in philosophy and elsewhere, it has moved beyond just the question of experience, because of course experience is a contested notion, right? When I say my experience is, or when I ask you about your experience, the question of experience is itself open to discussion, evaluation, contestation. In other words, it's not a straightforward issue where I can lay my experience on the table and say, this is my experience once and for all, this is going to settle it. That's the beginning of a conversation when I lay my experience on the table. So feminists have thought through this problem so that contemporary feminist philosophy and feminist philosophy of science, which is itself a whole branch of feminist philosophy, have tried to unpack this problem. Okay. So this is further discussion, particular wanted to mention Lorraine Code as one of the first to argue this case in a book form, and the important volume here from 1991, I believe, was What Can She Know? Feminist Theory and the Construction of Knowledge. Her argument was that as knowers, we're always located somewhere. In other words, we are not, as it were, abstract knowers. We're always knowers in a particular place. Okay? This opens up the door. As soon as feminist epistemology came on the scene, other people said, well, yes, wait a minute. This is our problem too, in particular, indigenous communities. And this has been a focal point in Canada, at least, where indigenous forms of knowing, which have traditionally not only been ignored, but have been deliberately, there have been deliberate attempts to wipe them out. That is, through years and years of residential schools where indigenous children were taken from homes and taught in religious schools in order to make them more Canadian, or more likely to be, in the Anglican schools, more British. That is to wipe out, as it were, both the language and forms of knowing. So indigenous forms of knowing has become an important calling card for indigenous politics in Canada, as it is elsewhere. This is a statement that appeared on the web page of the White House a month ago. And it's acknowledgement that the federal government should value and, as appropriate, respectfully include indigenous knowledge. This last month, this appeared on the webpage of the White House. So it's circulating, this notion that indigenous peoples have forms of knowledge, traditional knowledge, that are different from and in some way should be respected by what are really mainstream positions, is an important move. Okay. And I think I have another quote here. Yeah, here's a UNESCO quote, United Nations Educational and Cultural Organization. It says, local knowledge informs decision-making, fundamental aspect of daily life. Indigenous knowledge, particularly in Canada, is often referred to in relation to problems of environmental destruction, or in cases of ecological rebuilding of particular environments, natural environments. Okay. And I wanted to simply mention, if we go back for a second, I was fascinated, and I don't know much about it because everything I know about it is what I read in the English-speaking press, but I was fascinated by the whole debate about the Constitution in Chile because of its emphasis on particular indigenous movements, so which to me was fascinating. I don't know what you people feel, but I myself was a bit saddened that the Constitution was defeated, but maybe you feel differently, and it's not my business to involve myself in your politics, but it was a fascinating, because it was possibly the most progressive constitution in the world. Okay. So epistemic injustice, and I realize I'm now going to run out of time here. Within this ways of, we've now looked at how epistemology has become a much more open problem. That is, different peoples demand a say in their own forms of knowing. Miranda Fricker wrote a book in 2007, although she's been talking about it for some time. Is there a distinctively epistemic kind of injustice? So can we say that there are ways of knowing that are not good, that is, that are problematic in some fundamental way? And so what's important about this isn't that she raised the question, because we've already seen questions like it in the neo-Marxist tradition and sociology of knowledge tradition. But what she's done is she comes out of the analytic tradition. And so in the analytic tradition, she's taken an epistemological problem and turned it into an ethical problem. So it's no longer a question of knowing, it's a question of when does knowledge become unjust? And that's a new move and an important move. So what she tries to do in her book is merge, as it were, the analytic tradition with the post-Marxist tradition by turning epistemic injustice into an ethical problem, right? And she, go to the next slide. She says, an epistemic injustice is wrong done to someone specifically in their capacity as a knower. There's two kinds, excuse me, a testimonial injustice and a hermeneutical injustice. Testimonial injustice is what happens when prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word, and that's probably very familiar to you. In other words, we discount someone on the basis of their status, we discount someone on the basis of their gender, we discount what someone says on the basis of whatever background knowledge we have of them, right? Hermeneutical injustice is what occurs when a gap in collective interpretive resources puts someone at an unfair disadvantage when it comes to making sense of their social experience. And the example that Fricker uses again is a feminist example. She talks about a collective of women who were discussing the problems that they thought were unique to them, namely what were essentially unwanted advances by men. And they sat around discussing this and discovered that they had a lot in common and came up with a term for it, a term that is now widely used in the English language. The term was sexual harassment. And by labeling it, that is by giving it a name, suddenly people said, yes, this is my experience as well. And we've seen more recent versions of that, of course, with Me Too and Black Lives Matter. These are examples of what happens when you finally put a name to something that has no name. In other words, it has a particular resonance, a social resonance with people, because it suddenly enlightens, as it were, their experience. So Fricker says these are two of our most basic epistemic practices: conveying knowledge to others, where we get testimonial injustice, or making sense of our social experiences, which is a more complex process and hence a more complex version of epistemic injustice. And part of this comes out of the work of Foucault, of course. She introduces the term social power, Fricker does, as a way of arguing that, and I suppose you could call this Foucault-like, because she doesn't take on board the entire analysis that Foucault uses, namely the notion that power circulates above and below consciousness. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a more complex version of power. She simply says there's social power. There are people who have social power and others who are powerless. And within this, we can see that there are forms of hermeneutical and testimonial injustice that are related, seem always to be related, to the extent to which social power is distributed among groups. Okay? Okay, so I mentioned some of this. Hermeneutical injustice is both harmful and wrongful, because it's discriminatory and it's unfair. And she argues that unequal hermeneutical participation creates the foundation for hermeneutical injustice. Okay, I think I covered most of that. Hermeneutical injustice or epistemic injustice is, once you begin to look at it this way, is widespread, of course. marginalized people of all forms will suffer from this, and we see that the recovery from hermeneutical injustice in such movements as Me Too, Black Lives Matter. There's one caveat here. We don't want to separate hermeneutical injustice from what are, outright forms of oppression, that is, lack of access to resources and so on. So it's one aspect of marginalization, but it's an important feature of marginalization because it allows dominant groups to marginalize without saying they're marginalizing. In other words, it's a way of excluding people while saying you're not excluding them, right? It's a very subtle mechanism. And by labeling it as an epistemic injustice, it's a way of opening up the question of who gets to talk for whom. Okay? In the meantime, there are a whole range of related concepts that are now in circulation. Epistemic well-being, epistemic exclusion, epistemic oppression, epistemic violence, ethical violence. I'd be happy to give people references to this, but it's a long story, okay? And so the question is, are we guilty of perpetrating epistemic injustice in psychology? That's the question I want to end with. Is there some way in which we can recognize or take apart this question for psychological literature? So what happens when we test the child and give the child an IQ score? Is that an epistemic injustice? In other words, we take the child's experience and relegate it in some other language and some other form that has an institutional purpose. Now, I'm not saying that's an obvious question to which there's an obvious answer, but it is a particular problem that you might want to think about. In other words, who benefits when the child is given an IQ score? Do the parents benefit? Does the child benefit? If an IQ score is given, as it is in North America or Europe, to separate the child from other children or to give it particular additional resources to help it through the school system, is that an epistemic injustice? Perhaps, perhaps not. It's not a straightforward question. What happens when we give someone a diagnosis? You're a clinical psychologist, you're sitting in an office and you say, well, you're really suffering from an anxiety disorder. Is that a way of retelling a story that ought perhaps not to be retold? I don't know. I mean, of course, in no way do I want to deny the fact that counseling and clinical psychology does good work. I mean, I don't want to deny that that's an important form of reinterpreting experience in some cases, a necessary form of reinterpreting experience. But I raise it as a question because our diagnostic categories take something, as it were, that is institutionally prescribed and turn it into, as it were, a form of interpreting an experience for someone. And the same is true for things such as personality labels, introversion, extroversion, neuroticism. I've wrote about this some years ago under the context of an ethics of self-understanding, that what we need to negotiate as psychologists is the relationship between what we claim about others and what others claim about themselves. And that's not a straightforward question, and that the institutional labels that we provide for people are not necessarily the right labels at the right time. So that's, and I've just summarized it because I'm out of time and I'm going to stop in a moment. But I'd be happy to talk about that some more. So in conclusion, as we've seen through the history of epistemology and sociology of knowledge, psychology of knowledge, if you will, there's no solution to the skeptical problem. In other words, skepticism is always a question that can raise itself at any point. Claiming an epistemic injustice requires validation in the same sense that we need when we claim any injustice. We can always be wrong because there's no view from nowhere. But what the important work that Fricker has done is shows us the ethical conundrums of knowledge itself, that knowledge itself is not immune from challenges of what are essentially ethical challenges. And I think I'll leave it there. I'm sorry I've gone over time, but I'm happy to answer questions.